Welcome to the Curious Platypus. I'm Michael Edward, and today's piece is titled The View from Above. I was sitting in John's lap when the moment of truth arrived. As the door swung open to reveal the abyss that awaited me, that tiny cabin transformed into a howling tunnel that was being sucked inside out by the vortex that raged on the other side of its walls. In that moment, every last bit of confidence, which I had hitherto touted with such bravado, left my body. For as long as I can remember, I'd always wanted to jump out of a plane. This desire no doubt stemmed from my obsession with flying. As a kid, I spent many hours daydreaming about soaring through the air like Superman, and just as much time throwing little plastic army men attached to parachutes off the highest things I could find. As I aged, I sought experiences that would get me closer to this feeling. There was my trampoline phase, my cliff jumping phase, even a lucid dreaming phase. The idea there was to learn how to control my dreams so that I could fly all over the place in the land of Nod. My yearning to fly is also one of the things that saw my lifelong passion for skateboarding take off, as my shred sled allowed me to get closer than ever before to that weightless feeling of flight. And while all these things are wonderful facsimiles, nothing but the real experience was ever going to extinguish my desire to go skydiving. And so on my 17th birthday, my parents and I headed off on our 2-hour journey to the spot where I'd finally get to leap from a plane. The address the skydiving company provided led us to a large field in the outskirts of Bunbury. Other than the cow turds that littered this field, the only other landmark in sight was an enormous farm shed. "This must be the place," Dad said as we pulled up. Inside, we found 3 men who made up the entirety of the High Fly skydiving company. 2 instructors and 1 pilot. They were, to put it lightly, the sort of rough-looking country blokes one finds in the rural pubs of outback Australia. Except to be fair, all 3 looked somewhat fitter than your average barfly. John, one of the instructors, greeted us before quickly introducing me to Susan, the other first-time skydiver. As John gave me and Susan a pre-flight rundown, the other 2 men busily packed the parachutes, which at the time were still sprawled out on the floor. "Hey John, there's a rip in this chute," one of the blokes shouted. "Ah, she'll be right, mate. Just chuck some tape on it," John replied, playing along. I can't say I really understood this comment. I knew it was a joke done for mine and Susan's benefit, but it made me wonder why these guys would want to make us first-time jumpers more on edge than we already were. Although, as arrogant as it may sound, I wasn't scared. I was excited. After all, I'd been wanting to do this forever. Not only that, but for years I'd been puffing up my chest and confidently reassuring anyone who'd ask, "No way, I'm not scared to go skydiving. Besides, you only live once." Once we'd finished going over the pre-flight instructions, we hopped in our harnesses and jumped in the plane. After the excitement of a rather turbulent takeoff, I found myself wondering why the plane's cabin was so damn empty. Did these guys also use this plane to cart drugs, stripping away every unnecessary part to make more room for their smuggling operations? However, my musings were cut short as preparations continued. Next on the agenda, Susan and I were to be harnessed to the front of our respective instructors, the same way that babies are sometimes mounted to their parents' chest. I was strapped to John, and given that John was a 6-foot-something bloke who looked like he'd been throwing hay bales his whole life, and I was a skinny 5-foot-nothing teenager, his big spoon dwarfed my little spoon in a way that made me feel like some helpless fawn in the clutches of a bear. Once my torso was securely fastened to John, legs and arms left to dangle somewhere in between his, we all eagerly waited for the plane to reach its desired height. John watched the dial on his altitude gauge slowly climb. Susan chatted to her instructor Paul, and I tried to forget the fact that I was sitting in another man's lap. Then, Paul swung open the cabin door. Susan and Paul went first, and as I watched them violently tumble earthbound like a pair of conjoined rag dolls, I began frantically searching for something I could cling to. That's when I realized why that plane was so damn empty. It was to prevent any last-minute changes of heart. I wanted desperately to scream the words, "I don't want to do this, John!" But before I could, the bear had taken us both out the door. As the earth, the sky, and the horizon took turns flashing in and out of my vision, my stomach tried to keep up with my body by doing as many somersaults as possible. Once we'd performed enough triple twisting double pikes to endow me with a newfound sympathy for gymnasts, John finally decided to level us out, which allowed my vision to settle on the terrain below. The free fall was all I'd hoped it would be. Hurled into a hyper-focused state, all my sensory awareness ramped up to 11. I was able to take in so much of that moment all at once, while simultaneously having this serene calmness wash over me in a way that saw time and my internal dialogue melt away. What I found particularly interesting about falling for an extended amount of time was that once we'd leveled out, I was no longer aware of that feeling that pulls at the pit of your stomach when the ground falls out from under you. Instead, since there was nothing around for context, it didn't even feel like we were falling. It felt more like we were floating, the only difference being that there was a remarkable force of wind roaring up at us from below. I later realized that that so-called wind was actually us ripping through the air at ever-increasing speeds. But for those few blissful moments, that's not how it felt. In fact, the only obvious sign that we were falling came when I got a glance at John's altitude gauge, as the dial was spinning backwards so fast I thought it was going to fly off. Then I heard it, the unwanted noise that rudely yanked me out of my awe-stricken state. John, who I'd forgotten about, started screaming, "Woohoo!" in the same way someone riding a mechanical bull at a country fair might do. The first thing I thought when I heard John's howls of excitement were, I wish this cunt would shut the fuck up and just let me enjoy this. But then I got self-conscious. I wondered if I should be screaming woohoo as well. Was that the appropriate response to have in this situation? Did John think I was awfully quiet for someone who was midway through a 15,000-foot freefall? And so folding to peer pressure, I let out my own little woohoo, although I doubt John believed in its sincerity. Either way, a second later, John tapped me on the shoulder as it was time to pull the parachute. As I crossed my arms over my chest, I thought, well, this is it. If this chute doesn't open, me and this big screaming bear are dead. Once the chute deployed, John let me play with the handles that steer the parachute. As I careened us around in circles, John pointed out a few landmarks and the location of Susan and Paul, who were floating somewhere beneath us. I nodded along as if I was interested, while trying to take in the gravity of where I was and what had just happened. The most incredible thing about soaring around at that height was that I could see the world in a way I never had before. It was totally different from looking through the tiny window of a plane. Instead, from this unobstructed vantage point, the view of the world filled the entirety of my gaze. As the earth approached, I handed the reins back to John, who steered us back down to the turd-covered field where we made a rather inelegant landing. And in case you were wondering, no, we didn't land in a pile of cow shit. Somehow, John managed to avoid them. But we did meet the earth with enough force that we both ended up skidding along the ground on our butts until we finally came to a halt in the same position we'd been 15,000 feet above. Me securely ensconced in John's lap.